Today we're here to talk about the political continuum, or sometimes as it's known, the political spectrum. A spectrum or a continuum are essentially the same things. It just means it's a sliding scale. And we've probably already talked about in class how a spectrum works and how a continuum works, essentially looking at a sliding scale. And so the first thing that we can say about a continuum is there are no absolutes on a continuum. It doesn't mean that you're one thing or another, just like your grades can be on a sliding scale or colors can be on a sliding scale. A continuum means it's a sliding scale. So it's not like you're one of four things, it's your varying levels among those four things. But a sliding scale is just a way for us to sort of get an idea of generally what you think, how to classify people. The other limitation of a political continuum is it only tells us issue by issue. It doesn't tell us absolutely what a person is or isn't. It tells us what a person is or isn't based on those issues. So if I were to give you a continuum quiz that's only 5 questions long, the only thing that it could identify our position on the continuum is based on those 5 questions. The more questions you have, the more accurate of a picture you can be. But for example, you can be Republican on one issue, you can lean far to the right on one issue, and you can be Democrat on the other issue. You could lean far to the left. And I think that will be the case with many of you. You will fall in various different places on the continuum depending on what the issue is. We took this quiz in class. We'll talk a little bit more about what it means. Generally speaking, as you took the quiz in class, try to think of yourselves not as up, down, left, and right, but try to think of it as just a left and right scale. And as far as the up, down goes, you can flip that sideways and you can look at that as a left and right scale as well. So try not to get too confused with the 4 quadrants. What we're going to look at in class is essentially 2 different quadrants. Give you a second to take in this cartoon. Feel free to pause it if you need more time to read it. All right, moving on. So the basic thing that we talk about when we're talking about the continuum is how do people feel about change? And we can divide up into 4 general categories: radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. And we're going to look at these 4 categories for every issue that we look at through the remainder of class today. Now remember, this doesn't mean you're one of 4 things. You can be a very extreme radical, you could be a mild radical, you could be barely a radical but still a radical, you could be an extreme liberal, and so we generally tend to refer to this stuff as the further towards the radical side you are, the more to the left you are, and the more reactionary or conservative you are, the more to the right side of the scale you are. So it's not one of 4 things, but it's a sliding scale among those 4 things. So when we look at our scale of change, this is the biggest issue we usually look at when we look at the political continuum. When we look at a radical is somebody who wants a lot of change. They want a lot of change, they want immediate change, they want it to take place right now. A liberal is somebody who wants some change. They do want change, but they don't want things to be exactly the way they are. In between, we have a moderate. Generally speaking, for purposes of this class, we're not really going to refer to moderates, but sometimes if you're dead way between liberal and conservative, you are considered a moderate. We have a conservative as somebody who doesn't want any change. They want to keep things exactly the way they are, or the status quo, as we would sometimes say. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a reactionary, somebody who wants to go back to the good old days. Somebody who wants to return to a previous time. So we use the example in class of a train station. Somebody who likes the train station exactly how it is would be a conservative. Somebody who wants to remodel the train station, change it up a little bit, but keep the general gist of the train station would be a liberal. Somebody who thinks the train station is a waste and we need to start from scratch, blow it up, begin from the beginning, would be a radical. And a reactionary would be somebody who thinks that trains are a waste of time and we should go back to the days of horse and buggy. So that gives you an idea of how we stand on change. Generally speaking, when we look at the political continuum, we view things as far as change goes, but unfortunately that's not always 100% accurate. That's not the only way we can look at the continuum. Unfortunately, there is no cheat sheet for an easy way to remember the continuum. You're just going to have to learn things issue by issue. So let's go through a number of the issues and a number of things as we look at. Again, we look at this is the same as the chart we looked at before, our views on change. So again, somebody who wants a lot of change, more towards the left. Somebody who doesn't want any change or actually go back to the good old days, more towards the right. Now, we generally tend to define things in what we would call political labels, or political parties, if you will. And we're going to identify the political parties that generally tend to support those political labels: radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. When we do this breakdown, please note that we are breaking down only the general in the strictest definition of political labels. We'll look at what the TV labels look like in a minute. So this may not be the way you see things on TV or read about them in the internet or in magazines. This is the true political label. This is not necessarily the way it actually works out. So a radical would generally be associated with parties like the Green Party of the United States or the Communist Party. They are people who want a lot of change in society. Liberals are generally considered Democrats. Conservatives are generally considered Republicans. And reactionaries, smaller third parties like the U.S. Taxpayer Party, the Constitution Party, or the Tea Party if it actually was a political party. It's not. It's really just an ideology. But if it were a political party, they would be considered reactionary. Now, I mentioned that when we look at change and when we look at these labels, we're looking at truly what they actually are in reality and not the way that TV portrays stuff. So if we want to look at the TV labels, they would group the radicals and the liberals together and the conservatives and the reactionaries together. So by grouping radicals and liberals together, we get a TV liberal or a Democrat. And by grouping the conservatives and the reactionaries together, we get a TV conservative or a Republican. Because our system is very centric, it's focused more towards the middle of the ground, there aren't too many people on the extreme sides of either spectrum. Generally speaking, when we talk about Democrats or Republicans, we tend to include what we're calling the television labels. A Democrat would not just be truly a liberal, but most radicals get grouped in with Democrats as well. And most conservatives are Republicans, but reactionaries get grouped in as well. So that makes it a little bit confusing because what you hear on TV is going to be different than the strict definition of what a radical, liberal, conservative, or reactionary is. So if we take a look at sort of how things play out in our actual political system, we can see that there are very few liberals, true extremely liberal people. There are very few extremely conservative people in America. Most people in America fall towards the middle. Most people are either conservative or they are liberal. We don't see the extremes in America. Most people are sort of towards the middle. Most people, if they're not moderates, they're very much towards the middle. And that makes America unique from a lot of other countries. For example, if we went to France or Germany or even Great Britain, we would see a lot more people on the edges, on the fringes of being extremely liberal, or what we would call radical, or extremely conservative, what we would call reactionary. But we don't see that much in America. As much as we like to make a big deal out of the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, realistically, there's not a huge difference between them compared to other countries. Within our own system, it makes a big difference, but compared to other countries, there's not a huge difference. So now we're going to go through various different issues. So if we look at learning styles, nature versus nurture, what we mean by nurture is that you get your values by learning them. You learn them from society around you. And a radical would say that little babies, little children generally fall into the nurture category. They get their values from the people around them. Liberals would say that it's mostly nurture, although sometimes you are born good or bad or right or wrong. You're born knowing certain things, but for the most part, it's society that shapes you. Conservatives would say that it's mostly nature. You're born a certain way. It's biological. But still, there's a little bit of nurture involved in shaping who you are. And a reactionary would say that everything is biological. You are born the way you are, and it doesn't really matter the society you're in. It won't really change you. When we look at the idea of human nature, good versus bad, it doesn't mean that people are ultimately good people or bad people, but sort of where people are born. Uh, if we looked at the state of nature, would people do the right thing? And if you are a radical, you would believe that people are born good. In the state of nature, people would do the right thing if there were no laws in place. Liberals, of course, believe that people are a blank slate. Conservatives also believe people are a blank slate. And reactionaries would believe that people are born bad. And not that people are bad people, but generally speaking, people would do the wrong thing if there was no government in place. So, for example, James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But we have a government, which means government's necessary. He's just saying people would do the wrong thing if there was no government in place. When we look at the ends versus the means, what we're talking about is how do we achieve our goals? Is the way we achieve our goals worth what it takes to actually achieve them, the process? Does the process matter? And radicals would say that yes, you should do things by any means necessary. So if we want to create safety in America, radicals would say that we have to do everything that we can to create safety. Liberals would say that the ends don't necessarily justify the means, so would conservatives. And a reactionary, surprisingly, would believe the same thing as a radical. They would also believe that in order to achieve your ends, in order to achieve your goal, you should do things by any means necessary. Look at ends versus means. Maybe we might want to take the issue of something like civil rights. So a radical or a reactionary would say that if we want civil rights either in a positive or negative direction, we've got to do whatever it takes to achieve civil rights. And if that means protesting, if that means breaking the law, if that means turning towards violence, somebody like Malcolm X would be considered a radical. He said that whatever it takes to create equality for African Americans, that needs to be done during the civil rights movement. Somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. would have been more the conservative or the liberal point of view. He was probably more towards the liberal side, but when we look at somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., he would say, look, we do want to achieve equality for African Americans, but not necessarily to the point where we need to turn to violence. The ends, violence, don't justify the means. Equality. When it comes to equality, radicals believe that everybody should be totally equal. As you learned in U.S. history class, this would be communism. Liberals believe that we should move towards equality, that there should be government programs in place that try to encourage equality, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the ultimate goal. A conservative would believe that we don't necessarily need anybody to have additional programs to encourage equality, that things should be merit-based, that everything should be exactly the way it is. You get what you get, you earn what you earn, and you are what you are. A reactionary would say that equality is not necessary. Now, that doesn't mean that they want inequality within society. That just means that they don't believe equality should be the ultimate goal of what we do. When it comes to the role of government in our personal lives, or generally when it comes to social issues, we can classify people, although this doesn't work 100% of the time. But for the most part, a radical would believe that the government should not be involved in our personal lives. That what you do in the bedroom, that what you do in your free time, whether it's have an abortion or smoke marijuana or whatever it is that you do, and you probably shouldn't do that, but if you do, that's none of the government's business. You should be allowed to do whatever you want. A liberal would believe that the government should have some involvement in our personal lives, but still shouldn't really tell us what to do. A conservative would tell us that the government should have a lot of say in our personal lives, that it affects the world around us, but they shouldn't completely control our lives. And finally, a reactionary would say that the government should pretty much tell us what to do at all times. The government should be very involved in our personal lives and our social lives. And so if we want to look at a couple of those issues, we looked at the idea of abortion. A radical, and again, these are the true definitions, not necessarily what you see on TV. A radical would be somebody who is pro-choice, somebody who believes that there should be no restrictions on having an abortion. A liberal would believe that there should be a little bit of restriction, so maybe the third trimester is too much, but abortion should be legal in the first or second trimester. A conservative would say that we got to stick with what the current law is. That is the first trimester. Abortion is okay. After that is too much. And a reactionary would say that there should never be an abortion. They are the pro-life people. So if we were actually to look at this the true way that we see it on TV and not necessarily the true political values that we see here, radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary, generally TV doesn't differentiate between radical, liberal, conservative, and reactionary. Generally, TV would tell us that if you are pro-choice, you would be a radical or a liberal, and that would just be all grouped into one side, the liberals. And if you're a conservative or reactionary, we group that together and say that if you're any form of pro-life, you generally tend to be on the right-hand side of the spectrum. When it comes to same-sex marriage, gay marriage, radicals would say there should be no restrictions. Love is love, love wins, and we should let people get married if they want to get married. A liberal would also believe the same thing. There should be no restrictions. A conservative would believe that it's up to states to choose, since gay marriage is not listed in the Constitution. And a reactionary would say that gay marriage should not be permitted. Again, this is the true label, not the TV label. When it comes to freedom versus security, a radical would believe that freedom is more important than security, and we need to have freedom at all costs, even if it means sacrificing some security. Liberals would believe in mostly freedom. Freedom is really important. We should move towards freedom, but they would understand that there are some things that need to be done in the name of security. Conservatives would believe just the opposite, that we should lean mostly towards security, but you should still have some freedoms. And a reactionary would say, whatever you got to do to keep us safe, you need to do that. When it comes to military spending, how much money the government should spend on the military, radicals would say we should reduce the amount of military spending, and we should do so dramatically. Liberals would say we should slightly reduce the amount of military spending, but understand why we spend what we do. A conservative would say we should keep things exactly the way they are at the current levels, the status quo. And a reactionary would say we need to increase the amount of military spending out there. When it comes to guns, radicals would say there should be no guns. We need to ban all guns in all situations. Liberals would say that there should be more gun control measures put in place. It should be harder to get a gun, but still you have the right to own a gun. A conservative, a true conservative, would say status quo, keep the current system for buying and purchasing a firearm. And a reactionary would say that there should be no restrictions on guns, that everybody has the right to own a gun no matter what. When it comes to the government in the economy and the government's role in the economy, a radical would say that the government should get very heavily involved in regulating the economy. And of course, if there's going to be regulation, that means there's going to be taxes to pay for that regulation. Liberals would believe that we should have some regulation, probably more than we have right now, but it shouldn't be too much. Conservatives believe in limited regulation, so keep things exactly the way they are. And reactionaries would believe in no regulations. Go back to the days where we have no limits on what businesses can do. Government shouldn't get involved in the economy. Likewise, taxes. If you ask any politician, they will all tell you you should lower taxes, but if you're going to have government involvement in the economy, the government needs to pay for that somehow, and that comes from taxes. So radicals, in order to carry out the government programs, would generally believe that we need more taxes. They'll never actually tell you that, because if they do, they won't win an election. But generally speaking, if we have more government involved in the economy, we have to pay for that somehow. That comes in the form of taxes. Liberals believe roughly the same thing. Conservatives say limited taxes, so what we have now is enough. And a reactionary would believe we should go back to the good old days where there were no taxes. When it comes to the environment, radicals believe that the government should very much get involved in shaping the environment, and we need to do things on a very drastic level. We need to ban anything that is environmentally unfriendly. A liberal would believe that we need more environmental regulations, but let's not get too carried away. Conservatives, of course, status quo, keep things the way they currently are, and a reactionary would believe that there should be no regulations on the environment. When it comes to healthcare, a radical would believe that the government should provide all healthcare for all people free of cost, or really what's rolled into your taxes. A liberal would believe that you should still have the right to have private insurance, but that we need to have more government involvement in insurance. That's essentially what Obamacare is today. Conservatives would believe that there should be a mix of government and private, but at the current levels, so we don't need to increase the level of government, keep things the way they are. And a reactionary believes that all healthcare should be private. When it comes to the issue of social assistance, or what we would sometimes call welfare or unemployment insurance, radicals believe that we need to increase the levels, as do liberals. Conservatives would tell us things are pretty good the way they are, and a reactionary would tell us we need to get rid of welfare and we need to get rid of unemployment insurance. When it comes to the role of religion in government, radicals would generally believe that religion has no role in government and that there should be a strict separation of church and state. They follow the First Amendment to the letter of the law. Liberals believe that some values of our country, some values of our politicians should be influenced by religion, but not necessarily that religion should overtake things or that everything should be based solely on religion. Conservatives believe more in religious values, so there should be a lot of influence of religious values in the shaping of our nation. And a reactionary would believe in a theocracy. That is, the government and religion should be the same thing. When it comes to immigration, radicals would believe that anybody who is illegally immigrated into America should be able to stay. Liberals would believe that there should be a path to citizenship. That is, that if you came here illegally, we should try to find a way to help you stay, but not necessarily everybody who comes over illegally would be allowed to stay. A conservative would tell us that the current policy is fine, and a reactionary would tell us we should close off our borders. Forget allowing any immigration into the country. Immigration is bad, according to reactionaries. When it comes to the issues of climate change, or what you probably call global warming, the first thing that we have to look at is it caused by human activity? So what are the causes of global warming? And radicals would say that climate change, global warming, is caused by human activity. Liberals would say probably. We're not really sure, but it's not really a bad thing if we start to do things to try to solve for the problem of climate change. So let's work to fix the issue of climate change. Conservatives also would say maybe climate change is caused by human activity, but before we do anything too crazy, let's wait for the evidence to come out. And a reactionary would say there is no relationship between human activity and climate change. They're what we would call a climate change denier. On the same issue of climate change, when we look at what should we do about climate change, a radical says that we should take drastic steps to stop climate change. So, for example, if cars pollute, we should ban all automobiles because they will hurt the environment. A liberal would say that we need to take steps in order to reduce climate change, whether that's being government subsidies to encourage fuel-efficient cars or taxing cars that burn more gasoline. We should have more regulations in place, but that doesn't mean ban cars. A conservative would say that we should have a market-based solution, such as cap and trade. What that means is we should limit pollution at the current levels that each company has, and if companies want to sell the right to pollute to other companies, then they can do so. And a reactionary would say that global warming is a joke. There's no such thing as global warming, and so we shouldn't really even deal with the issue. If we want to look at a lot more issues and a lot more ways of viewing the world as far as left and right goes, feel free to take a look at this chart. This is also up on Moodle, so feel free to download and take your time if you really want to go issue by issue and see the difference between what the left and the right thinks. And of course, there are more issues on your sheet, particularly when it comes to voting patterns. We're going to spend some more time going over the various issues in class. I just want to remind you before we finish up here that, again, everything that we've looked at as far as left and right goes, generally speaking, is the way we would look at things on a true political continuum. The big world outside of class is not a true political continuum. The left is usually made up of radicals and liberals, and the right is usually made up of conservatives and reactionaries in the real world. So when you watch TV or when you watch the news or read in a newspaper and you hear somebody referred to as a conservative or a liberal, they're not talking about the true definition we went over in class. They are talking about the more general TV sense of clumping people together. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of our political values and what it means to be on the political continuum. And with that, we'll bring this discussion to an end.